in a way, this is very intimidating. I mean, we've had, I think, 4 fantastic presentations, and it's been really very stimulating. I console myself with the fact that this is a day on which one of the top quantitative researchers in the US has been talking about in-depth interviews, and an ethnographer's been producing fairly high-powered statistics, so what can I do? Okay, so look, let me, I suppose, make a couple of reflections, and these are, as Mark said, there were no very clear writing instructions, so in a way I guess what I really want to do is to raise a couple of issues that are interesting to me out of this. I think the first and most obvious one for somebody who ostensibly runs a research program in employment and education is that employment lies behind so much of what we've been hearing about. And perhaps the thing that sort of really resonated so very clearly with me was actually one of the comments that Bruce made about the economic event that, if you like, lies, the single most powerful economic event that lies behind the growth of mass incarceration in the US, and that is the loss of low-skill jobs for men. And I think that this is a really key issue. It's a big issue in Australia too that we often are not terribly aware of. And as a challenge, it seems to me it's something that we really don't have any very clear answers to. Although some of the issues are, I think, obvious and interesting, even if we don't know what the answers are. So, of course, one of the really paradoxical things that's happened is that even though employment opportunities for low-skilled men have been declining, for low-skilled women, they've been actually rising, particularly, and this is very clear. And I think the comparison between Australia and the US on this is very interesting, because in Australia, what we seem to be moving towards actually in a lot of the kinds of areas where low-skilled women are finding jobs, and I'm thinking particularly of the kind of community services areas, paid care work and so on, in sharp contrast to the US, is better pay and probably better quality jobs, although the quality issue is a little unclear. I did find it interesting that Kathy made the comment that much of the work amongst the people that she interviewed was regarded as not having very much intrinsic meaning, and yet I noticed that almost all of them were service workers, actually, and of course many of them were childcare workers and aged care workers and so on. And I mean, my understanding is that actually the arguments in this area are that it is the intrinsic meaning of the work that often keeps people in these jobs despite the problems with them. So I think that's an interesting phenomenon. So I mean, I guess that what I'm thinking is that there seem to be a series of issues in relation to work that lie behind this: the absence or presence of work, its meaning, its gendered character, and the quality of jobs. And can I just, maybe one other reflection, I was really delighted to have the meaning of money brought back in. I think that in the areas that we're talking about, this is obviously really important. It resonates very much with work that we've been doing in relation to paid parental leave, oddly enough, perhaps not so directly related to poverty kinds of issues, but I think there are some very interesting issues about how people, what meaning people attach to paid parental leave. So, okay, so maybe I'll leave it at that. I probably talked longer than I should have, and see who's next.
From the point of view of Aboriginal and Islander research in Australia, and picking up particularly on the discussions on Black Americans, there wasn't any input on Indigenous Americans, and finding a lot of commonalities in what was presented with the Australian situation, but also some contrasts. Historically, Bruce put me into the 1960s talking about civil rights demonstrations. And just down here, I was in a demonstration in 1967 when 5,000 of us walked into the city and were all arrested. And it's probably appropriate to say that the father of Bruce and Mark was involved in that political movement. And but he was certainly involved with the political movement. And so we had a very difficult law and order time in Queensland that went on with our Premier, Bjelke Petersen, well into the 1980s. And that was reflected in lots of incarceration happening for people who didn't conform, and especially Aboriginal people. And so I found Bruce's profile of Massachusetts inmates of prisons very similar to Australian profiles of Aboriginal prisoners in terms of many of the variables that he outlined. Fortunately, I'm not sure what the situation in the States is, but fortunately we're now starting to get state governments who are prepared to bite the bullet and experiment with low security prisons. For too long it was a case of the normalisation ideology being overridden by the law and order policy, and politicians insisting that everyone had to be locked up in high security at great cost, rather than consider that the thugs be allowed to somehow normalise back into society. So there is a certain amount of reform happening in Australia on that front. And then I was inspired by Glenn's presentation and his combining of moral passion and rigorous analysis. But drawing from that period in the 1960s, one of the mentors was an English lecturer, Dan O'Neill, who used to speak about having social courage in Queensland to stand up to the system and to try to implement reform. So that prompted my question about addressing longitudinal violence and other social problems in our society. And I'm not going to dwell on it now, but in my research we've developed a strong ideology to try to put that into action, and a set of analyses to try to evaluate it and justify it, which include classifications of violence types, but also based on a precept or an assumption that change is necessary from within the community, and that sensitive cultural understandings are required, and social capital needs to be empowered. Leadership and social cohesion need to be empowered. And of course, they're often being disempowered, which leads me into Kathy's talk, because I was picked up on this idea of Clinton's ideology of replacing the citizen right, the taken for granted citizen right, with the citizen responsibility. First, the citizen must exert their responsibility, and only then may they get a right or an entitlement, which is a fairly clever political construction, and one that's been going on in Aboriginal Australia recently, starting with our Northern Territory intervention, and the idea of conditionality coming as a theory, a sociological theory to use in understanding how politicians construct or enshrine behavioural change of the citizens through rights and responsibility arguments. And so in Aboriginal Australia we've got now interconnections of sexual assault and paedophilia with tenancy agreements and income management and sending your children to school, being a good tenant, all intertwined in forms of conditionality by different jurisdictions to try to implement behavioural change, which often undermines the types of social capitals that I'm talking about that need to be reinforced. Because ultimately, if you're trying to deal with longitudinal violence, the value systems need to be driven from within the perpetrator victim group. So, as an anthropologist, some of the contrasting constructs that I deal with in Aboriginal Australia that weren't brought up today in the American context were construct of person, or the construct of self, and particularly in Aboriginal Australia, relational or social construct of person, which leads into the strong values attached to kinship as a driver of as a driving value, and also as a driver of residential mobility. To move on to the last presentation, and another important construct, place attachment, theory of place attachment, place identity, which is very important in understanding Aboriginal residential dynamics and movements. So I've probably said enough. That's just some of the ideas that were going through my head during the presentations. Thank you.
Excited about today and the opportunity to listen to these scholars, and in addition to it being truly rewarding, I couldn't help thinking all the way through about the relationship between what you were saying with Australia and also research that I've been involved in, and both the similarities and also the quite apparent differences, particularly the way that culture was consistently brought up, or at least implicitly, poverty, and also identity and housing and homelessness, and the importance of those ideas in the research themes. I was really interested in the way that Bruce spoke about incarceration rates in the US, and many others have spoken about the prevalence in society, and I was wondering that, given that it's so commonplace, whether people, how it was perceived in terms of whether among African American youth, whether going to prison was seen as something that was stigmatised, or as part of what some people call the cool pose culture, or indeed, did going to prison for such a long time and coming out, did that have implications for how people came to come to see themselves and their identity? And is there a kind of a jail identity in the way there is associated to be a drug identity and a homeless identity and other types of identities? I was also really interested in terms of the policy implications, or perhaps the absence of them. Is there a thirst for the type of research and the questions that you're asking to reduce recidivism? The type of research that you're working on obviously has positive policy implications in terms of better responses for people in prison, also when they're exiting prison, so to enhance their well-being and reduce recidivism. I'm wondering if that's something that people are interested in, and if there is debate and discussion at the policy level around how we can reduce the significant numbers of people in the US. And I imagine that there would be tensions in terms of the prison and incarceration phenomena being a large industry in business, and there must be many powerful stakeholders that perhaps are not doing so poorly with the high prison rate, and I wonder how that plays out. Glenn obviously touched on some very similar types of themes, but from a different perspective, and I found them really, really challenging and inspiring at the same time, and especially the way that you incorporated the rigorous analysis and also the reflexivity and the engagement on a personal level. I was wondering how some of the things that you would say would relate to what I know many peers are writing in the US. One that I just mentioned, Orlando Patterson, but there's also William Julius Wilson and Mario Small, in terms of their suggestion that scholars need to engage with questions of culture when thinking about poverty, and many people have been reluctant to do so because of concerns with blaming the victim, but they suggest there's an important dimension to do so if there are better understandings can be arrived at. I know in Australia, some Indigenous leaders, Noel Pearson, for example, and others have spoken about the importance of engaging with questions about self-responsibility and other types of areas. But similarly, that's an area that many non-Indigenous Australians have been reluctant to engage with for the similar types of reasons that you mentioned. Just very, very briefly, Kathy's presentation, this is the third time that I've been able to listen to Kathy, and it's always really, really good to be able to hear the way that you integrate, again, ethnographic research with with a lot of quantitative and other types of designs, and I think there were so many similarities with what you were saying with what's happened in Australia over the last 15 years, particularly under the Conservative government. They've very much changed the nature of the transfer of state funds from welfare into what we call middle class, or what we rhetorically call middle class welfare in Australia, through the family tax A and B system, which is very much a non-stigmatised form of welfare, but nevertheless it's a form of welfare. And not only is it non-stigmatised, but in addition to family tax benefits, are also incentives around owning investment properties, which have become so embedded within our society and so fundamental to the electorate that it's almost, if not impossible, it's very, very challenging to try and undo some of these non-stigmatised forms of welfare, given their centrality in the economy. Also really like the way that you would also looking at the social dimensions of money, and the way that people interact and interpret these forms of welfare or tax differently. In some research that I've done, there was some profound implications for the identity that people enact, depending on whether they were recipients of voluntary soup and food from a handout outreach service in public places, compared to when they were able to go and purchase food and drinks from subsidised cafes. And there was a much more capacity for people to express agency and autonomy and a side of themselves separate to their poverty and homelessness, whereas in the passive delivery of charitable goods, there certainly was much less capacity for people to do that. And I think there was some really strong parallels between what you're saying there and some things that I've been thinking about. It was great to hear Matt, someone who I thought I'd be able to say lots about, but then when he started talking about modelling, I was a bit more out of my depth. But I'm thinking of the policy implications, and Dennis Culhane has often said that there's many millions of people in the US in worst housing need, but the only palatable way to respond to them in terms of the US electorate is to focus on those people in imminent need of eviction in terms of early intervention, a way to mitigate the eviction, ensure that there are many people, what does he say, to ensure that we're not addressing, responding to false positive cases, and that is people that were never going to be evicted unless we gave them money. And I think your research shows the importance of responding to eviction, because essentially it stops people from spiralling in and out of a similar type of situation of deprivation, but also identifies some clear risk factors and triggers that I think from a policy perspective supports the idea of early intervention to those people in risk of tenancy failure. That's it. Thank you.
The presentations today, I think that it's been a fantastic success, so it's been really good. I have just three random observations on the four presentations today. The first is the macro policies that were covered by all four speakers. The second is the legitimacy of police in the context of these presentations, and the third observation is this neighbourhood context theme that I think has run through most of the presentations today. So really the first issue that really struck me is this integration, or this coming together of housing, income, welfare policies with crime and crime control policies. And punishment policies as well. So I think that what's so interesting here is that these macro policies from very related but different domains have really very fundamental impacts on micro-organisational behaviours. And I'm thinking here about the ability trial. We have a trial looking at truanting kids, and it's a trial that's being run by the police, but it has implications and partnerships that the police are forging with education and with communities. So I think that one of the themes that I've seen that has been covered today is how these different domains of housing, income, welfare, crime and crime policies, punishment policies are really coming together. And I think that the Institute is really seriously looking at this integration across the different policies. So the second theme that I read into these papers, it might not have been explicitly discussed, is the role of police and justice agencies in either perpetuating or hopefully at some point in ameliorating some of these problems. And Glenn made a point of, the police having too much discretion and how this may be impacting on some of these problems. And I guess I took from these papers is that justice agencies and police in particular have gone through, such fundamental change over the last 20 or 30 years. And in the 1970s, the real failure of police gave rise to the community corrections movement. That also was a big failure, which gave rise to a lot of the punishment policies, which we can now see are a massive failure as well. So there's not a lot that we can say about positive crime policies when you look at it over that life course, but that kind of belies some of the successes of what's happening on the ground in terms of better policing and better community corrections and better rehabilitative programs within prisons, maybe not necessarily in America, but certainly elsewhere in the world. So it's a complex story of what major reforms have occurred and how they've both failed and how they hide some of the successes. So the third random thought was around the neighbourhood context of all of this, and I think all four speakers very much talked about that neighbourhood context, and as people are aware, it's an area of research that Rebecca Weeks and others in our group have been focusing on. So within this neighbourhood context, we've got individuals in places, and I think that was important to not lose sight of. And we've got networks of people both within and outside of these networks. And we've got these neighbourhoods in city contexts. And I could go on about this for quite some time, but I do think that this neighbourhood context was a very important theme running across all four of the papers today. So thank you very much.
Whites, when you take into account the fact that individuals who are in an environment in which they are on the high end of the distribution of income will have a proclivity to want to exhibit that by adapting their consumption patterns in order to reflect the fact that they have more income than their neighbors. Acting white, the phenomenon of peer groups amongst African Americans encouraging their members not to pursue academic excellence because that is thought to be acting white. Well, the economist Roland Fryer and his colleagues studying this issue carefully find that that pattern of behavior among African Americans is most pronounced in environments where African Americans are in the minority of the youngsters in the high school. You don't see the acting white peer pressure nearly as much in high schools which are majority black. So do we want to attribute that pattern of behavior to blacks as such without any reference to the larger social... Now, so I say all of that to say, yeah, culture matters, obviously, but not in some stick-figured way in which you just slap cultural attributes onto racially defined populations without reference to the broader context in which they're operating. Black culture in America is American culture.
Can I just add to that? I agree with what you're saying. I think the situation's a bit different in Australia because we've got only 2% of our population as being Aboriginal people. So there's a lot more pressure on them as a minority, and also things happen which recycle and reinforce traditional culture. Be the biggest one that's happened in the last 20 years is the Native Title Act, where groups are seeking native title. And so all around the country we have native title applications, including in metropolitan areas like Brisbane, where groups are making native title applications which involve them putting forward evidence on maintaining a system of laws and customs since sovereignty, maintaining an identity. So as much as cultural change might have been undergoing vigorously up into the 1990s, that's one of the things that it's tending to reverse it to a degree. But having said that, anthropologists now are talking and theorising about the intercultural, that most people, because of globalisation, are carrying around subconsciously a whole range of intercultural behaviours and cognitions, and that any analysis needs to accept and recognise that.
Maybe I can, since you just spoke, I can talk a little bit, Paul, about the comments you and Cameron made about citizenship. In the United States, and I think this is somewhat different from Australia, welfare never achieved the status of a social right like it did in parts of Europe. In some ways, welfare never escaped the branding of the poorhouse in the United States. I was just in Mark Granovetter's office at Stanford, and he was showing me all these old books that had descriptions of welfare recipients from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. Welfare recipients were scum, right? And what we're doing now is we're transferring a lot more money to poor folks, or we're kind of keeping the promise of America. And I think the EITC works in America because it is America, and because we have this whole Marlboro Man, Horatio Alger, mythology, kind of in our DNA, in our political DNA. Now, I could sort of step back from that and say, maybe in a more Glenn Lowry sort of fashion, ought citizenship to be tied to work? Well, I actually don't believe that. So I will say that, and I think it's worth thinking about that question. I think in the United States, as sort of a policy scholar, that train has left the station, and the welfare rights movement is dead. And as the EITC may be coming under political attack, I'm interested in preserving it. But it is very interesting how the line between the deserving and the undeserving poor has been redrawn, with work really as the marker of citizenship. And the fact that we're letting 2.8 million children, we're lifting 3.3 million children a year out of poverty with the EITC. We're consigning 2.8 million children every month to living in households with no cash. So this is some sort of evidence about how bankrupt in some ways this policy is, because it doesn't support people who aren't working. Many probably because they actually can't work, and we do have a robust disability system. It's complicated. It's a little quixotic, but we need to look more at that group and understand that group and figure out what to do for those folks, to also bring them across the road, to use T.H. Marshall's imagery. So, and one more thing I will say is the EITC and the old system it replaced completely ignores men. Now, if we can see unprecedented numbers of women join the ranks of the working poor in fairly unrewarding, when I say unrewarding, to respond to your excellent observation, I really misspoke. Unrewarding financially, unrewarding jobs. If we can draw women into the labor market in that fashion, we should be trying to do so with men as well. So we've got to think of ways to extend that hand across the road to the many men who are ending up in Glenn's story and in Bruce's story.
I thought these were, God, this panel's almost sort of too big for me at this point in the day. I thought these were really great reflections, all of them, and there's a lot to chew on here. I want to pick up sort of two things. I don't know how coherent this is going to be. One of the things I would sort of like to think. So we've spent 3 days together now, and we've sort of been listening to each other talk for 3 days. And as I listen to all of the comments, actually, I'm thinking there's a thread that runs through the work of all of us on this panel, and it's there's a coherent research program here, and it has two kinds of elements, at least two kinds of elements. One is, I think, we're all trying to reveal a social reality that isn't very well understood in American society generally, and there are conditions of really acute material deprivation that resist observation with conventional quantitative sorts of methods, population-based methods, and so something very bad is going on in American society right now, that under conditions of sort of great affluence, people are living extremely poorly, and I think all of this work is trying to provide a very textured picture of really acute conditions of material deprivation. Things like poverty statistics and so on really are not doing very good justice to. And the other thought I had was to sort of thinking about culture. In a way, who's doing culture here? In a way, we're sort of doing culture, right?
Here.
We, the panelists, because and we're doing so in the following respect. And I think this work is, all of this work is normatively inflected in a way that is certainly at one end of a spectrum, of sort of a positive normative spectrum in American social science, and I wonder if the usual very sharp distinction that's drawn between positive and normative analysis, we're sort of fuzzying that distinction up. I mean, Glenn's exploding it, right? Exactly. But even for the rest of the three of us, I think we're really trying to, because we're grappling with the people that we're studying as moral agents, we ourselves are taking part in a live conversation about the moral valence of American poverty, right? And I think we're doing that. We're doing that pretty deliberately. So I think in some sense we're doing culture, and I think this is yeah. I mean, I think this is the direction in which this kind of research program has to move. It's very difficult at the moment in America to be on the sidelines politically of these social and economic trends. That's all I want to say for now.
Yeah, I'm with Bruce. That's a lot. I'm about to open the bottle of wine.
We should have.
Instead of the wine. And yeah, this has just been just an amazingly stimulating opportunity on a lot of different levels. And so I think to understand poverty in America today, maybe in any society, we have to focus on 5 institutions: employment, the criminal justice system, the family, the neighborhood, and housing. And I don't think that any one of those institutions has automatic primacy or is more fundamental than
Forgot the welfare state.
any of the ones.
But that's okay.
Okay, 6 then, but 5. And so a lot of my work these days has been thinking of, okay, if housing, if we put housing in the center, how would that change how we think about things? And I think it's absolutely right that employment has to be front and center. and we need to talk about jobs, and not just any jobs, right? Good jobs. But I think at the same time, we also need to talk about expenditures, or extraction, or exploitation, if you will, where the money's going, and who it's going to. And so if we have a situation where incomes are increasing, if expenditures are increasing faster in terms of energy or housing costs or college tuition, education costs, medical costs, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter with respect to lived experience of poverty. And so, what would that mean policy-wise? What would that mean in an era where rent control is dead, or when in an era where when we're always talking about putting more stuff in the bucket and not plugging its holes? What would that look like? This is something I'm trying to get my head around these days, and I think it speaks to Paul's question about questioning the fundamentals, anyways. And so if we're talking about the meaning of something, the meaning of land, and how land should be used, and land for whom, and why, would be one that I think is on the table. Is on the table for a discussion, a moral discussion. And I really like, there's a way to combine Cameron and Lorraine's comments about interventions and the kind of overlapping connections with these five institutions. And so I think, Lorraine was one way that Lorraine was pushing me in ways, I think, is to speak about the law as a direct cause of poverty. Who's evicting these people after all? In the end, the state is, and so the state is investing much more money in extractive capabilities of poor families than keeping poor families in their homes. So what would that mean with respect to a short-term intervention to keep folks in their homes? Well, one thing, this is a little soapbox that I've been on lately, but one thing it could mean is giving poor folks lawyers in housing court. That's a pretty small investment, 1 hour of time maybe, for a pretty substantial payoff. And then I think that has everything to do not only with what's right to do and what is potentially very effective at short-term intervention. When the stimulus money hit Milwaukee, by the way, and was just given folks for like a one-time anti-eviction punch, the eviction rate in the city decreased by 16%. So it's not the case that these things will be in someone's pocket and the next month they're gonna be out. I think these short-term things can actually work. And I think that it has everything to do with, an individual intervention having neighborhood effects. And so, people lose neighborhoods and neighborhoods lose people, and students lose schools. And so one kind of deep-seated mechanism for why these neighborhoods do feel so strained, and often people do feel isolated in these neighborhoods, is because they're turning over so much, precisely because of how the housing market is being organized and being ran in these types of neighborhoods. So I think that this is, here's one example where the intervention is short-term, it's a legal intervention, and it could have broader effects for poverty in the neighborhood. So a few short reactions.
We have a little bit of time for comments or questions from the audience. If people want to burn.
I just had a question actually for Kathy and maybe Mark. When you're speaking about the EITC, you're saying that it's an end tax credit, so you need to be working together. So what are the implications in this time of recession where there's a lot of people who are basically not in work or they can't find work because they want to? Because in the UK, there's something quite similar happening with the government, the Conservative government, and there's just, when their reasoning was that they're trying to get the people, the chronically unemployed back into work, and then trying to make people work instead of people who are able to work but can't work. Have you really found that in the UK, in the US, or?
We have two sorts of disability in the United States. We have SSI and SSDI. These SSDI is for people sort of who've had a longer work history and so on, and SSI is for people who may not have a work history but are disabled and unable to work. it's tricky to get on these programs, but these programs have grown dramatically, both since welfare reform and especially during the recession. Food stamps has grown dramatically during the recession. The EITC's growth is sort of monotonic, right? Which is very interesting. It has a very, very high take-up rate. But single mothers' labor force participation has taken a little bit of a hit in the recession, but there's no increase in TANF. So I think the real problem with our safety net is that we don't have anything that catches you when you fall, and we really see this in the recession. I spent 3 months this summer with 5 families who fit within this second study I'm doing on the cashless poor, on people in extreme poverty. And there in any given month there are 1.4 million American families in this situation. This is unprecedented in America, and the number of these families, the best survey in the United States that measures income and program participation is called the SIP. The Census Bureau runs it. It's a survey of income and program participation. By looking at all sources of income, including cash contributions from family and friends, we find that the number of people in that situation since 1996 has doubled. And again, the rise has been monotonic. You can even see it in the late 1990s in this boom economy. So this really indicates that there are people who are falling through the cracks who really, can't work, but can't manage to get on disability either. So this is sort of an understudied group. They're hard to find. Even though there are 1.4 million of them, people cycle in and out of this status. There are some folks that are in it for a longer time. But one of my goals in the near future is to work with 3 colleagues at the University of Michigan to really find these folks and figure out what's going on with them.
Michelle?
So Glenn, I'd like to challenge you a little bit on what you said, in that you don't pick high forms and saying, okay, we have these high forms of culture, we have these low forms of culture, and then kind of expanding on that, and looking at perhaps not necessarily that there are specific ethno-racial forms of culture, cultural capital, but that perhaps forms of cultural capital are valued differently within specific ethno-racial groups. And I say this because of the type of work that I do, with Indigenous populations in Canada, the US, and ideally with, third group here in Australia. Is that, in this phenomenon of what's more generally known as walking in 2 worlds, but, what I have respondents who affectionately refer to it as, 1 foot in the boat, 1 foot in the canoe. And they talk about this idea of, having white culture, and having this idea of Native American culture, and having to be sort of well-versed in these different forms of cultural capital in order to be able to succeed in these very different arenas. So, and I wouldn't go so far as, I wouldn't go so far to say that, with Indigenous populations, there are Indigenous forms of culture per se, but I would say that they definitely value different forms of cultural capital in that respect. So I'm wondering if maybe that might be something that you could, potentially see as maybe a different way to kind of frame what you're thinking of, as opposed to talking about this kind of like idea of, there's no Black culture out there, but maybe just sort of different forms of cultural capital that are valued differently depending on the population we might be talking about.
So I think, I don't know anything about the Aboriginal population and the social dynamics around that in this country, but I think this analogy is strained, this analogy between race on the one hand and native status or whatever on the other. I mean, I think you have to explain how it is that emancipation in 1863 in the United States of the enslaved population at that time is followed by a century and a half of social segmentation and reproduction of difference. What are we talking about when we talk about blackness in the United States? exactly what is that phenomenon and how has it come to be reproduced? I mean, this is not a separate group of people. These are not a group of people who have descended from some distinct cultural development. These are Americans. This is intermarriage. Well, you know, if we look at ethnic groups of European origin at, I don't know, 120 years ago in the United Jews from Russia, Italians or Irish or Slavs or whatever, they're living somewhat distinctly. They are identifiably distinct culturally. They're not white in 1890 or 1910 or 1930. But by the time you get to 1960, they are white. Whiteness somehow comes into being. Whiteness and blackness. These are achievements. These are cultural products. These are outcomes. They're not a reflection of things given in nature. So I'm not disputing that at a cross-section, if we observe and chronicle how it is that people impute meaning to various artifacts or practices or whatever, one won't see differential patterns across these aggregates that we're imputing racialness to. But I'm saying that's the thing to be explained.
Mm-hmm.
Wojtek, Trio, and then I think we will have to call it to a close.
And, can I go first? I guess this is to Kathy and Bruce. Well, as you mentioned that there is no kind of equivalent of this EITC policy for people who are out of work, right? Such a policy. So, conspiracy theory of sort would perhaps suggest if we have no idea what to do with those people, let's put them all into jail. So, you know, do you think there's a little bit of that truth in that sort of thing? Like, you know, the state doesn't know what to do with those people, hence the expansion of those penals.
You know, it's interesting that the figures I gave were just for families with children. Mm-hmm. So mostly they're not going to jail, but their partners are. I'll let Bruce reflect on the rest of that answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think Glenn really spoke to this in a way. It seems very difficult for me to see how you could adopt policies which would send 70% of your young people to prison if those young people were part of the vast mainstream of American society. Could we have adopted the policies that generated mass incarceration if the criminal justice system was sucking up young white kids who were using drugs, involved in violence and disorder and so on? It's very difficult for me to imagine a world in which that is happening. And so I think policymakers, at a minimum, discounting the humanity, the welfare of those who are at greatest risk of incarceration. They're sort of superfluous to the society in some sense. And at some level they're economically superfluous. And it may even go further than that, right? There may be, and certainly in political talk and so on, you can find examples where policymakers are not just engaging in what Michael Tomery calls malign neglect, but there's active animosity, there's active racial animosity that's motivating the policy process, in which sentiments of punishment and retribution have an edge in which I think social damage is the purpose of policy. I don't think that's happening particularly in a state like Massachusetts today, but I think in general, but definitely in other times and places in the period of the prison boom, which is only the last 40 years, I think you can find that much harsher sentiment.
I have a question on geography of poverty. In the United States, the poverty actually concentrates in some inner cities. So I'm just thinking about some public policies dealing with issues like that. Maybe, for example, the public housing, they try to build the public housing in different areas to see if the breakdown of the concentration. So I just wonder the effectiveness of the policies. Oh boy.
Place-based interventions. This was exactly the last question that we received in the panel in Canberra.
Go ahead, Ben.
So poverty's been, the spatial distribution of poverty in America is changing. It's deconcentrating. It's spreading out, and it's relocating often to suburban areas, and that's changing the lived experience of poverty in those areas. How do you distribute social services when people are living 10 miles away from where the social services get distributed? How do people find jobs or reach jobs when there's no public transportation in the suburbs? And so poverty policy needs to catch up to where poverty is moving these days, I think.
But half of all poverty is in rural areas, and that's been true for a long time. So we just don't, it's very unpopular in America to study rural poverty for whatever reason, and it's a shame. Yeah.
All right, I think I'm going to have to call it to a close. I'd just like to do a couple of things. One is I would of course like to thank all the speakers. This has been a tremendous sort of day. I was like Bill. I think I was slightly apprehensive about how this might go. It's actually quite intimidating in some ways to have you guys lined up here and sort of speaking to us. So it's been terrific. It's been really sort of fantastic, and I've greatly appreciated the seriousness with which you've taken it and the way in which you've engaged. It's been great, and I have certainly appreciated and been very, very profoundly pleased by the sort of the quality of the conversation, the quality of the dialogue, and the quality of the engagement. And I think it says something wonderful about the Institute, that we have had this quality of engagement, and it's really been very, very gratifying for me. So I'd like to thank all of you. There are two people I would like to thank as well for just their contributions. Anna Morton, who is manning the staffing the camera down there, has been responsible for establishing much of the AV and really ensuring that we will have a sort of an enduring record of this interaction, and I'd like to thank her for that. And then Cassie Hughes, my EA, who is standing there, has essentially been responsible for everything else and made sure that it works so effectively. And Cassie, as everybody knows, is basically what keeps the Institute functioning. And now, if Cassie had a Cassie, then I probably would have some flowers to give to Cassie. I think it's malign, benign neglect in this case is probably a way of describing it. So I would like to thank you all for coming, thank you all for your participation. I hope the rain has stopped, because we're actually going to evict you fairly quickly, because we have a little bit of media stuff that we want to do with these people before we let them go and break open their bottles of wine. So thank you all again for coming.
Thank you.
And all the best.